So, welcome to the Nordic Pavilion. My name is Communication here in the Nordic Council of Ministers that is hosting the pavilion. And we are at the event called Climate and Nature at the Crossroads. And we are honored to have a dialogue with two very distinguished scientists, Johan Rockström and Alexandre Antonelli, as they explore the vital links between climate and biodiversity, challenges, opportunities. We will explore cutting-edge climate and biodiversity research, contrasts and connections between Nordic countries, discuss how science can be made more relatable and inspiring across cultures and regions. And I say some introductions, even though most of you, of course, know them. Alexandre Antonelli is a director of science at the Royal Botanic Gardens in Kiev, professor of university at the University of Gothenburg. He founded Hidden Diversity Hub Foundation to help ensure a future where biodiversity is understood. Johan Rockström is of Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research, professor at the University of Stockholm. He is an internationally recognized scientist on global sustainability and earth resilience, among other things. And he led the development of planetary boundaries framework for human development for the current era of rapid global change. So I tried to challenge the rain. Let's see. So both of you are driving forces behind a myriad international scientific initiatives, and I'm happy to welcome here. I think I will start with you, Alex. Could you explain what hidden biodiversity is and why it might be crucial for ecological and planetary resilience in the face of climate change?
All right, can you hear me? Yeah, okay, good. So I think nature is our biggest ally in terms of fighting climate change and some of the biggest challenge we're having in terms of biodiversity loss and food insecurity. And the fact that biodiversity has been our ally for hundreds of thousands of years is quite incredible. But even so, we've just scratched the surface. And we know that we've only found about 15% of all species on the planet. And every year we're finding about 17,000 new species to science. And each one of them, of course, play an important role in ecosystems, but most of the times we have no idea about them. So this is really the idea of this hidden universe that we're trying to unveil so we can really understand how we can use some of those species to maintain healthy ecosystems, but also derive benefits to us, including carbon sequestration, but many other things that nature gives us every day for free.
Thank you. And Johan, do you think we still are too siloed, tackling climate and biodiversity as separate crises? And what risks do you see with missing interdependence when we design global strategies?
Yes, so, one of the things that we really need to push here at COP30 in Belém is the scientific evidence that we definitely have an urgent need to phase out fossil fuels. And that must be the first focus because that is the number one driver of the crisis we're in. But we also know that even if we succeed in phasing out fossil fuels in record speed to a net zero world economy by 2050, we will still fail. We will still breach 1.5 degrees Celsius if we do not bring back the boundaries on biodiversity, on land system configuration, on fresh water, and overloading of nitrogen and phosphorus, because we know that the Earth system's biosphere, the nature, will in itself risk flipping over from a net carbon sink to a net carbon source. And we released just yesterday 10 new insights in climate science for 2025. And 2 of those insights, which is a summary of the scientific knowledge we have today, are really concerning with regards to what we're seeing today. Number one, which is quite unexpected, is that the temperate forests, the boreal forest, and the permafrost systems from 2016 onwards have tipped over from sink to starting to be a source. So we're starting to see the first signs of losing resilience, even in the temperate and boreal ecosystems. And we know already before coming to Belém that the Brazilian part of the Amazon rainforest has already flipped over from no longer being a carbon sink, but a net source. These are very, very worrying signs. But I agree with Alexandre that they are signs of instability, but they're not conclusions of a tipping point. If we invest in refurbishing biodiversity, we can regenerate these systems. But it's a very alarming signal, which of course COP30 must take very seriously. And the biggest danger, to close this, is that we have to help each other to let's say, guide the policy discussions, because the risk is, as many of you in this room knows, because I recognize you being so engaged on this whole agenda, that we tend to risk focusing only on nature or only on the TFFF or only on the agricultural transition, often even as a political way of avoiding the elephant in the room, which is fossil fuel phase out. So we have to help the negotiations to do both at the same time with speed. And I think that is the fundamental message that science is showing very clearly here at Belém.
Alex, in Brazil, if from continue, but from your point of view, in Brazil you have witnessed firsthand how tropical ecosystems are both biodiversity treasure and powerful carbon sinks. Yet, in international policy, climate action often takes priority over biodiversity. Where do you see the biggest tensions between these 2 agendas, and how could it be, balance the shift?
Thank you. Yeah, so as Johan is saying, we can't choose, we either do the one or the other. And I think the key thing here is to tackle that in a holistic way. I think that there's some real dangers of only discussing climate or only discussing nature, because we live all in one planet, and I think the planetary health is a very interesting objective for us, because if you, for instance, are only interested in sequestering carbon, let's say, you will choose a very different methodology to the one if you want to try to bring back species that are facing extinction. So we know that now, for instance, among plants, about 45% of all species are threatened. They're going to disappear unless we do something quite drastic. So, for instance, ecological restoration is a key measure of both benefiting biodiversity and bringing back some of those species from the brink of extinction, and also capturing carbon. So I think the risks here are not to think holistically from the design phase. And when you then, for instance, are trying to do the good thing, you might actually do the wrong thing by planting monocultures of exotic species. And we've seen too many of those cases. We've seen vast efforts to plant millions and billions of trees, but that's not the way forward. We have to revive some of those ecosystems, because there'll be benefits to the livelihoods, to climate, and to biodiversity as well.
Thank you. And this is for the biodiversity crisis of an economic system out of balance. And how should they be realigned?
I'm not sure I understand what you mean. How realized in terms of understanding the impacts on the economy, or?
Yes.
Yeah, no, I mean, this is something that I would argue we've come a long way in mapping the economic values of not only ecosystem services, which we all know are fundamentally driving human well-being and societal developments. I mean, from food to energy to clean air to all forms of biomass-based services into the economy. But we also depend on the fundamental functions of ecosystems and the regulating functions that they have for a stable climate system. And this is something that we're taking for granted. It's a kind of the biggest subsidy to the global economy is that 50% of the carbon dioxide from fossil fuel burning is not in the atmosphere causing the climate crisis we're so deep in. It's in the ocean and it's an intact nature on land. If we would put a dollar number on that, we would have a trillion US dollar market value, which of course I call that a subsidy from the planet. And we have to factor that in as a value. And we need to maintain that and secure that. Instead, we're subsidizing what is damaging the climate system and biodiversity by subsidizing fossil fuels with 4 trillion US dollars per year. So this is, we've come a long way in understanding these relationships. I think the best study we have today in the world is the Partha Gupta Economics of Biodiversity report that was actually prepared for COP26 in Glasgow. It still remains kind of the reference point. He talked of strong sustainability measures in the economy to use planetary boundaries to set quantitative guardrails within which the economy has to operate. I still think that's a very, pragmatic but also practical way of developing this forward, because if you talk to any economists, even Chicago economists, they will say that the driver of incentives in the economy is constraints, and constraints comes out of budgets, and budgets are finite, and finite budgets originates from guardrails, and guardrails can be set for nature. So you have a finite carbon budget, but you also have a finite budget for land and biodiversity and freshwater, nitrogen and phosphorus. And I think that's what we need to move forward towards. Are we doing that? No. We're still allowing ourselves to subsidize our economy by destroying nature. And this is something that we know so well how to deviate away from. What does that mean for COP30 in a situation where we, of course, cannot magically have a transformation of the global economic paradigm? Well, I think the first step is to recognize that we need to start setting a price on carbon, and that has to also include nature. It should include the carbon stocks and the carbon fluxes from nature, not only the carbon price in the energy system. Again, we know how to do this. There are methods for this. And I think we should start talking about this seriously. You may say, well, isn't that a bit too optimistic? I think no. Actually, over 40 national jurisdictions in the world are already today operating a price on carbon. The European Union will be coming through with a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is already stimulating countries around the world to set up domestic carbon markets to be able to match, to avoid paying to Brussels, to instead pay domestically. So I think we're in a quite interesting moment to correct exactly these economic failures.
Alex, would you like to comment on that?
Well, I'll just say that beyond all those very large numbers, and I do think there is a bit of a moral aspect of this as well. So we are basically effectively destroying our planet, and I think that every species and ecosystem that parallels is a failure of humankind. So I think from my position, growing up in the most biodiverse country here in Brazil, I just feel a deep sense of frustration that now the economics of our financial systems and how we are not paying for the true value of the commodities we buy is really putting that long-term damage, which we'll never be able to bring back. So it's a irreversible pathway in many ways, and that's why it's so concerning. When we do drive species to extinction and ecosystems to collapse, there's no coming back.
And and I guess we share the frustration here in the faces of. I think I will allow to us, since we are in the Nordic Pavilion, come with a Nordic approach. And Johan, talking about tipping points, the Ocean Circulations Team, AMOC, is one of the most discussed tipping points in the Nordic region. What would a possible collapse mean for our climate and biodiversity?
Yeah, thanks. And in a way, it's encouraging to hear that you say that it's one of the most discussed topics in the Nordics, because I've felt very frustrated that it's not in the top of mind among all the heads of state in the Nordic region. Because in the IPCC 6 assessment, the AMOC, which is the overturning of heat in the North Atlantic, one of the 3 thermodynamic engines that drives the whole overturning of heat and therefore also flux of water and nature, which enables all life in the ocean to have these enormous upwellings of nutrients and the exchange of heat. I mean, this is basically what keeps the marine systems on planet Earth functioning. One of these three engines is now threatened. That's the aim. This is the overturning circulation system just south of Greenland. It functions in a very delicate way with saline, high density, warm freshwater flowing in the surface ocean from the Southern Ocean, reaching the tip of Greenland, releasing heat to the atmosphere, making it possible for us to live in the Nordic region. This heavy saline water then sinks because it's so heavy, and it flows back in the ocean floor all the way back to the Southern Ocean, and it circulates in this way. Now what's happening is, because of the change of the climate, the rapid ice melt from Greenland, this heavy saline water is diluted by fresh water. It gets less heavy, so it sinks slower, and it slows down the whole engine. We see the observations, the systems have slowed down by 15%, but there's a lot of uncertainty whether it may shut down even within this century. So IPCC put the conclusion in a qualitative way to say it is a low likelihood event with low confidence. This is the IPCC language to say we don't know. Okay? I mean, I'm a little bit. I mean, we're supporting the IPCC. We're close friends, but I mean, it's just an honest assessment that we simply have too little evidence. Since the IPCC cutoff point, we have now 6-7 big studies that have been published, particularly from Utrecht University, running for the first time a big global climate model, a fully coupled carbon cycle, showing that the AMOC does shut down even with intermediate emission scenarios. The latest paper shows a 37% likelihood of a shutdown this century, even on a RCP 4.5 trajectory this century. If you ask Stefan Rahmstorf, the world's authority on AMOC science, he says today that the AMOC shutdown this century is no longer a low likelihood event. It has a likelihood of between 1 and 10% within this century. Well, I can tell you that if something of an AMOC collapse has a likelihood of 1 to 10% for an impact which is catastrophic, it would accelerate warming across the entire world, it would shift the monsoon systems, it would make it abruptly colder and really threaten life conditions in the Nordic region. And if you think of risk as insurance companies do, risk is equal to probability times impact. So if impact is unacceptable, then even a low probability is something you don't want to accept. So 1 to 10% probability is a very high level for a catastrophic impact. Think of an aircraft. Would you ever step on an aircraft if the likelihood of crashing is 1 to 10%? Of course not. So this is where we are today. That was a letter written to the Nordic Council of Ministers and the heads of state in Reykjavik. And I'm glad to hear that that is now becoming more and more discussion, because I think this is an example of an unacceptable risk, even if there is uncertainty. Now, what would it imply for biodiversity and for life support? Well, it would change the fundamental conditions for marine life at very, very large levels. It wouldn't stop south of Greenland, and it could have a major impact even on the biological carbon pump, which removes carbon from the surface layer, helping the solubility pump, the physics of carbon dioxide uptake in the ocean, to function. So, we would have very likely unintended and unexpected feedbacks that can impact the very marine life conditions at vast levels. And it would very likely also lock in the surface layer of the ocean to very high temperatures. I mean, it's already at very high temperatures. It's threatening all the coral reef systems, but that would probably be locked in even further. So, the AMOC is, in my view, one of these really high-risk science assessments that we need to use as a support for acceleration away from danger.
Thank you. So would you like to, from the diversity point of view, reflections?
Well, I think there's a tendency to point fingers from countries such as in other countries where some of the issues that we are discussing here are not restricted to tropical regions, and including Borneo or the Amazon. I think the amount of devastation that occurs now on land in the Nordic countries in terms of the forestry the unsustainability of it is something that we're not even seeing in Borneo or in the Congo Basin or in the Amazon rainforest. So I think it's just about also looking inwards in our own backyard in terms of what's happening there, because the percentage is the tiny fragments that exist within the Nordic countries of old growth biodiverse forests, and the fact that, for instance, there are more than 1,000 species in the Nordic countries which are directly affected by unsustainable forestry is something that really doesn't allow us to start talking about tropical countries and their problems. So I think that it is a cohesive issue, and it's something that we really have to sort out by ourselves before we start telling other countries what to do.
For that, and that's here, it's very important that we take a look how we do things in the Nordics. Alex, how can we ensure, if we talk about nature-based solutions, that they work both for climate and ecosystems and are not like on the expense of each other?
Yeah, so we do have solutions across the board in terms of what is it we're trying to tackle. And I think, for instance, if you have tsunamis and waves affecting those low-lying countries in Bangladesh, the traditional idea is to create those concrete barriers or physical infrastructure rather than, for instance, storing mangroves. So I think that in many cases it's just about learning from nature, and the fact that many of the places on the planet which are now affected by flooding are actually previously covered by wetlands, and there are solutions which are based on finding species that really absorb and retain water, and that's the same case with tropical rainforests. So, one of the projects we're working on here is in the Atlantic forest of Brazil, where I don't know how many of you have heard of it, but it's basically the little sister of the Amazon. It's about 1/3 of the size of the Amazon, used to cover the entire eastern part of South America. Hugely diverse, one of the global biodiversity hotspots, but also massively degraded, about just 8% left. And this is not only a problem about all the carbon that has been released in the destruction of that rainforest, or the many species that have been put at risk of extinction. So, for instance, in the Atlantic forest, we have about 5,000 species of trees. 82% of those are threatened. That's the highest level I know of, even compared to Madagascar, where the similar threats exist there as well. But here, what happens is that when you have a heavy rainfall, like we just hearing the thundering outside, if you have a forest, it acts as a sponge, right? So we will absorb the water and release it slowly afterwards. But if you don't have it, then you have a bit of a toilet flush effect, where this is really released massively, and that causes landslides, killing hundreds of people every time, and also, of course, causing erosion of the soils and putting at risk the agriculture that is so important for the millions of livelihoods in those regions. So I think that nature can teach us about how to tackle some of those challenges, so we don't always have to start reinventing through engineering, and also combining high technologies, including assessing how species are coping with problems today in terms of aerodynamics and using mimicry. So basically learning from different species solution to some of the challenges we have, and that I think is a very promising approach moving forward.
Johan, would you like to comment, or so this is for you? In light of this being a food system, so I would like briefly to about the new E-Lancet Commission report that you launched in Stockholm, October. What role does food systems play to stay within planetary boundaries?
Yes, so it's, I would argue, very clear today in the scientific evidence that there are two transformations that have to occur simultaneously. And if we succeed with them, we have a very good chance of not only having a safe climate future, but actually coming back in within the safe operating space of planetary boundaries. And one is, of course, the energy transition, but the second one is the food system transition. And in the E-Lancet Commission, we have for the first time quantified for all the 9 planetary boundaries the share of the food system, the responsibility of the food system for all the 9 boundaries. And we find, not so surprisingly, that 5 of the 9 boundaries are predominantly breached because of the food system. And we're talking about 30% of the greenhouse gases, particularly methane and nitrogen oxide, coming from agriculture. So that's 1/3 of emissions. number one sector causing the climate crisis in terms of economic sectors. Number two is that agriculture is the primary driver of biodiversity loss. It's the world's by far largest consumer of fresh water, particularly withdrawing the blue water that maintains aquatic ecosystems. It is fundamentally the number one cause for overloading of nitrogen and phosphorus, and it's a major cause for chemical pollutants, particularly through pesticides. So this makes the food system like planetary culprit number one, but it also means that the food system is a major, major untapped potential, because in the Eat Lancet Commission report, we, for the first time, run a model into comparison with 11 modeling groups, testing, can we feed the world's population, even 10 billion people, within the safe planetary boundaries, if we combine healthy diets, which we also mapped in the Eat Lancet Commission. I won't go through the details there, but it's essentially more plant-based proteins, less animal protein, more unsaturated fats, and then whole grain. So it's a flexitarian diet with 50% coming from plant-based nutrients, a smaller fraction from animal protein. Now, if we eat healthy diets combined with the practices we know on sustainable ecological intensification and combine it with reducing food waste, those three together, and if you then add the mitigation pathway of decarbonizing global energy system, we bring us back within all the mapped planetary boundaries. So that's quite an encouraging story, that food system plus energy transition has an enormous potential to bring us back. And the beauty here, as we become double winners, it's good for human health and for planetary health. So it's also a very positive story.
If I can just comment on that, I cannot agree more. And I think that at the same time, as we see food systems as the biggest problem for many of those challenges, it is also the biggest opportunity. And I just would like to add that there's a huge untapped potential from the plant world, for instance. At Kew we have the world's largest collections of plants and fungi. We know that now we have at least mapped more than 7,000 plant species which are used as crops in different parts of the world. But more than 40% of all calories come from only 3 species, rice, wheat, and maize. So we eat just like a cow, and that makes us incredibly vulnerable to climate change. And the war on the Ukraine, for instance, it supplies of wheat to Africa. And you take things like the Cavendish banana, which is the most common banana you'll buy. It's transported all over the world. A lot of emissions associated with that. And you have this fungal disease, which we can't just tackle in any ways. But in the East tropical African mountains, for instance, you have about 1,000 different species of bananas. We also have the false banana, which is a stable crop, the tree against hunger, that can be used in sub-Saharan Africa. And it's an incredibly tolerant species to drought and heat waves. So there's so many different opportunities in the plant world which can replace animal protein in many cases, but also tapping on the indigenous and local knowledge that exists across the world. So I think food is really a key to success in this case.
Thank you. And actually, now I think that I would open for questions, comments from the audience. And since we have this technical situation, we have to try out or closer. Any questions? Any comments? Yeah.
Hello, both of you. One of the things that I like to talk about, Johan, you mentioned intact nature and the importance or relative importance of saving what we have already versus everybody talking about restoration. And I wonder if both of you might comment on that.
Yeah, thanks, Harvey. I can start from actually taking it from a climate perspective to given that we are at a climate COP here. So the fact that land-based ecosystems still absorb 25% of the carbon dioxide that we emit from fossil fuel burning happens only in intact nature. It's only the 50% of the land area that we have not yet transformed into agriculture, urban areas, and infrastructure. So we are so blessed that we've not destroyed more natural ecosystems, and that these ecosystems are still standing and are still on aggregate, net carbon sinks despite all the stress that they're under with the fires, the droughts, the heat waves, the reinforced storms. And that is the number one task, to maintain and protect those natural ecosystems. It's not about regeneration, it's not about restoration, it's about protecting them. We have to stop the expansion of agriculture into intact nature. We cannot lose more Amazon forest. We know that if we lose more than 25% of the canopy cover in the Amazon basin, it may tip already at 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming, because the combination is very, very detrimental, because you lose the moisture feedback capacity, which holds the rainforest as a moist, humid rainforest. So that is one part of this, which means that everything we talk about when it comes to regeneration and restoration comes beyond that. Now the question is, what is that then? Is that part of carbon dioxide removal, which has to, by the way, reach a level of 5 to 10 billion tons of carbon dioxide per year to minimize the overshoot? Or is it part of a FOLU, the transition of the food system from net source to net sink? Or is it simply a buffer to keep intact nature a bit more protected? I can tell you that this is completely confusing. If you talk to the CDR crowd, they will actually consider all forms of restoration as part of the CDR, which is, I would argue, completely wrong, because the CDR has to be technologies for carbon dioxide removal. It cannot be nature providing a service which we have already factored into the models that we assume to occur in intact nature and for the FOLU transition. What I'm trying to say is that minimize overshoot and come back to 1.5. We have carbon budgets for all the components in the transformation. One is the remaining carbon budget for fossil fuels. It's down to 130 billion tons of carbon dioxide. It's 3 years of emissions. Intact nature is another 10 gigatons of uptake each year. The AFOLU transition is going from 3 plus to -5. It's a green revolution. It requires restoration. It requires afforestation. CDR is 5 to 10 gigatons per year to keep overshoot as a minimum. So I think your question, Harvey, is so complex, and it requires to basically account for nature in the right places. But what we're doing today is that we're kind of doing some investments in nature over here in a voluntary carbon market, and then using it as an offset to go slow on mitigation, meaning fossil fuel phase out. And this is scientifically not adding up. So, well, basically what I'm doing, unfortunately, I'm opening a whole new seminar. I'm sorry.
Can I just comment as well? I think, just as we were discussing earlier, we have no choice. It's not about one or the other. And I think the first thing is absolutely stop cutting down the Amazon and cutting down forests. And we have so much degraded land on this planet, which we can use in so many better ways. But that said, there are ways of bringing back some of those ecological functions. And I have nothing against engineers. I love engineers, and I think that the technological solutions are going to be absolutely crucial. Again, working hand in hand with nature-based solutions. But we cannot engineer our way out of this crisis. And I think that I struggle to understand how people don't really see the ecological functions, which may take hundreds of years to accumulate. So, some of you, and I know you, Harvey, you were able to visit a research station which we built now in the biggest center of rainforest outside Rio. So we have a research station where we're taking people to really showcase what a single tree can do for the planet. So we're assessing the whole diversity, finding thousands of species associated with a single tropical tree, and all the carbons accumulating as a way of communicating that a forest is not only piles of carbon. It's so much more than that. So we absolutely have to protect those, old growth forests and all the natural ecosystems. At the same time as we need to learn from nature what success looks like and use that knowledge to start restoring at the same time. So we're here to work on the Paris Agreement, which is mostly about climate. But the biodiversity COPs are now trying to implement the global biodiversity framework, which has the goal of protecting and restoring 30% of the planet. And I think two agendas have to come together much more, in a much more integrated way, because therefore, if we do that, I think we can really tackle those big challenges together.
Thank you. Any more questions?
Thank you to you both. Question also for you both. What gives you hope that we will achieve this turnaround, which is necessary? What gives you hope? What let you stand up every day and do your work?
like I can start briefly. It's a big question. I mean, to start with, I think it's important. We had a session with Antonio Guterres in the run-up to COP30, where we gave the Secretary General a briefing, and the clear message from science was the first thing we need to say in public in Belém is we need to accept that so far we have failed. We come to Belém at a point of failure, and that has to be a sobering starting point, that now is the time. We cannot just focus on hope and the light in the tunnel all the time. We have to see that, we were clear 10 years back that we had to bend the global curve of emissions 2020. And now we're 5 years into this decade and we have still just added more risk to the agenda. So that is the starting point. The hope is that it's a failure so far. It's not a complete failure, because the resilience from the living systems on planet Earth remains remarkably strong. The planet is still dominated by dampening feedbacks. We still have a planet that is actually buffering the stress caused by our abuse to the system. And secondly, we also know that powering the global economy with renewable energy and transitioning towards a healthy, sustainable food future is absolutely possible to do. This is not a fantasy journey anymore at all. This is possible, necessary. It's a question of unlocking the right conditions in the governance and in the policy regime. So that is what keeps me at least running even faster, because we know that we're sitting on a kind of a double card here. Card one, global risk. Card two, we have the opportunity to solve this. And of course, when you combine that, it makes you angry, but also able to use that adrenaline, I think, in a constructive way. So I think we should actually be just pushing even harder, given that we are at such a mature state on showing that sustainability is not a sacrifice. It's a path to to cite the dear President of the United States. If you want to win, you go sustainable. And I think that keeps me going.
Yes, for me, I've learned philosophy from Winnie the Pooh. There are two kinds of problems. The problems that you can do something about, and the problems that you can't do anything about. And those that you cannot do anything about, there's no point in worrying about them, because you can't do anything about them anyway. And then the problems we can do something about. And climate change, biodiversity loss, food insecurity, they're all things we can fix. And it's not a romantic idea, as Johan is saying. It is something that is mechanistically possible, and we know how to do it. It's just about the willingness, of course, of our governments, of ourselves, our companies. And what keeps me out of bed and really excites me is that I keep meeting wonderful people doing wonderful things. And the fact that perhaps the negotiations are going really slowly, and you have all the geopolitics, I think we have to choose what to focus our energy on and our time on. And there are some really good success stories. And I think those success stories can really make us compelled to actually keep going. And I do believe that the sum of the parts here can be much more than the individual parts themselves.
There was one more question over there. You were.
Can I? Hey, I don't know. Okay, thank you. So my question relates to the cause of failure, because I think that we have failed because we haven't been able to include in our economy the price of degradation. So degradation bears physical and financial risks that our economy has not been able to include in a financial system. And capital markets are extremely efficient in reallocating funding and financial assets towards what is efficient versus inefficient. So once we're going to be able, and I've been working in agriculture for many years, and the most valuable carbon is the carbon stored in the soil, not the carbon that the farmer sells in the offset market. So what are we missing, and what are the key components to include physical and financial risk linked to environmental regulation in our economic system, which I believe is going to be the main driver for change economically at a global scale?
No, but I think in a way you partly answered the question yourself. I mean, I think it's about risk and about internalizing environmental costs. And this is the most basic, most well-established mainstream economic failure of them all, that we are still allowing ourselves to exploit nature for free without any cost and not factoring it into, any balance sheet anywhere. And if we would start having nature on the balance sheet and putting an economic price on it, even if it's not the perfect value of the system, it would be a very important step forward. But I think it would be absolutely insufficient. I mean, it would perhaps have been enough 30 years ago, but today, because we're facing unmanageable risks, I mean, risks that go beyond adaptation, the kind of the Winnie the Pooh type category of non-manageable problems, and because we now scientifically can see where they are, and we have to deviate that point, I think we need much more risk assessments as well in financial institutions. And the financial institutions are really good at that. They do that all the time, but they don't do it for environmental risks. They're starting to do it, but that has to come up much more centrally. So I think what we discussed earlier on the AMOC, for example, should be right at the heart of what's happening at Goldman Sachs, and that is what we need to be much better at informing as well. So it's both putting a price, but also having better risk assessments.
And if I can just add to that, I think the report that Johan referred to, the Dasgupta from Partha Dasgupta on the economics of biodiversity, really showed, for instance, that there are three main sorts of capital in the planet, right? So the natural capital, the built capital, and the human capital. And I think the fact that our societies have developed incredibly over the last decades has been to the price of the natural capital. So over the last 50 years, there's been an increase of almost 100% in capital in terms of cities, in terms of buildings. And every 7 days, we have a new Paris, if you just put together all the buildings, and that's a report from the United Nations Environmental Program. But the natural capital has decreased by 40%. So it has not been taken into account. And I think here there's also a huge importance for governments to play in terms of regulation. So, for instance, you can't just allow gold extraction to continue. Our planet doesn't need any more gold. It can go to the Bank of England. It's totally useless in terms of what we can do with it. And yet we are destroying the Amazon to produce gold. So I think there must be much more regulation in terms of what's allowed internationally in the global market. And I think that has to come into the recognition that we're not paying the full price of the commodities we buy today.
Thank you. Questions, one here and then one here. Yeah.
Thanks. Rolf Rudden from the Arctic Monitoring Assessment Program. Thank you both for very insightful presentations, also underlining the urgency in the state we're in, but also for providing hope. And I would like to focus on the last thing here and also moving into action. So as we are at the Nordic Pavilion, and as the fact is that the Arctic, there's no place where the climate is changing faster than in the Arctic, more than 3 times the global rate. What kind of role can the Nordic countries take when it comes to providing these solutions? And where is the highest potential? In other words, where should we focus the efforts in the Nordic countries?
Yeah, thanks. Well, to begin with, just to confirm what you just said, I even use that definition in public today, that the Arctic region is the planetary ground zero, because not only that warming is occurring 2 to 3 times faster, but also because 6 of the tipping elements, of the 16 tipping elements we've mapped, are all in the Arctic region. So it's the Greenland ice sheet, it's the AMOC, it's the permafrost, it's the Labrador Sea current, the Barents Sea ice, the Arctic winter ice. This is a regulator of the stability of the entire climate system, but it's also the basis for well-being and livelihoods in the Nordic region. So I think that is one really important factor to bring in. But I think your question ties more to what role can the Nordic countries themselves play, and does it matter what the Nordic countries do? Well, definitely. I even argue quite strongly that the Nordic region plays a disproportionately large influence in the world, because it's a respected region in the world when it comes to showing that you can have a modern, healthy welfare system that takes sustainability very seriously. And we are among the few economies that can really prove that you can disconnect emissions from economic growth. And I think that is something that we should be very proud of, and we should push that very hard as part of the coalitions of the willing to support André Correa do Lago in accelerating the pathway to implementation. So if the Nordic region can be like a full-scale laboratory to show that zero carbon and good economic development is something that goes hand in hand, I think that's the way to go. And we've been arguing that for a long time in the Nordic region. It's very concerning that you see a few governments, I won't cite them, that are starting to show signs of pulling back, which I find to be a very, very big disappointment. But it's not too late. I think the world is still looking at the Nordic region with admiration and respect.
I think just to add here, the leadership role, I agree, is the most important because of this disproportionate impact and the role of diplomacy in this. The only other aspect I would like to bring in is the role of companies. And I think that Nordic countries have so many different companies which are active in so many different countries, including here, where you can really demonstrate and move much faster than your governments perhaps are going to do themselves. So I think there's some great potential here. And I think, back to your question, there's a big role here to show, but you have to lead by example. You can't just tell others what to do.
Then we have one more here.
I understand that you guys are not political scientists, but I think a lot of what you said depends a lot on government action to happen. And we see that many governments, in many countries, we are seeing governments who are not paying attention to the environment. And we see, unfortunately, we are voting for governments who are not interested doing what they have to do in the environment. So my question is, why do you think that's happening? Why do so many politicians and why so many people don't listen to what the science so clearly says? And if they do, why don't they put that in their priority list when they decide who they're voting for? Is it a matter of science communication? Is it a matter of pressures from other actors making people not listen to you? Is it a matter of people talking about other issues that they are posed to them as more important than the environmental issues we're facing? How do you see the role of politics into that and the role of science relating to politics, not to policy, but to politics?
Okay, maybe I can start here. I think one of the fundamental issues with politicians is that you want to get re-elected in 4 years. And I think the issue with what we're talking about here are long-term, impacts which are going to affect all of us, but perhaps not within your mandate period. And therefore, we have to really show leadership politically as well in terms of making a decision now, which will cost a lot of money, but will save money in the longer term. And I think when we're talking about the big issues here, it is climate change, it is biodiversity loss, which will affect all of us. I think there's also a very important role for governments to regulate. And that's also, again, about leadership and about being up to scrutiny. Because if you regulate or through taxations or levies, or we're talking about subsidies, you will not be very popular. And if what we are trying to do is really to get as many voters as possible, maybe that's not what we're going to do. So I think that politicians do have a huge, great role to play. But my third point is about cash flows. Because, coming from the global south, I do see those big discussions in terms of very large numbers. When we're talking about biodiversity, the funding gap to implement the global biodiversity framework is in the region of about $700 billion per year. And that's just to implement that, that goal of protecting and restoring 30% of the planet, for instance. We absolutely need to find funding mechanisms. FFF and others are part of the equation, but we have a huge need now of diversifying those funding mechanisms and making sure that those funds come to the countries which need it most. So if we're talking about global problems, we need global collaboration, and that does involve cash flows and supporting other countries so that we can collectively save our small little planet that we live all on.
One more. We had two more. You first, and then the back. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program as well. But my question actually isn't about the Arctic, but the food systems. So it was such an interesting point you mentioned that how the transformation of the food systems could help us. And yet, that's my understanding. I don't think the discussion about the food systems is yet at the level where we would like to see it. We don't have COPs related to food systems, etc., etc. There was a point that Johan, you mentioned about unlocking governance solutions, and I wanted to ask, where do you see those? How can we unlock those mechanisms to start shifting food systems more concretely moving forward? Thank you.
Yeah, I can recommend you to read the Lancet report. There's a whole chapter on this. 23 action points, actually. But I think you're absolutely right. You could put it simple to say that the food system transition is somewhere 20 to 25 years behind the climate agenda, an agenda we're still failing on. So you can just imagine where we are on the food system. And that's in the need for even more acceleration. So far, the way we've dealt with scientific guidance on healthy food has largely been through, national dietary guidelines. There are only roughly this number of countries in the world that have national dietary guidelines on both health and sustainability. The Nordic region being one of them, actually. That is one step. Having all countries in the world having scientifically based national dietary guidelines that factoring both sustainability and health. The second is, I think we need to think, just as we've been discussing here, on taxes and policies related to health damaging foods. So, all forms of salt, sugar, ultra processed food, different forms of really unsustainable practices need to be taxed or somehow economically, penalized in relation to those production systems and consuming systems that give, basically the outcome that we need. This is very sensitive because, food is so diverse and so personal and so deeply anchored in local cultures that, the Eat Lancet Commission has wrongly been accused of being some kind of top-down imposition of one type of diet, when in reality we just give the best scientific evidence of, if you care about your own health, this is what gives you the best outcomes. More fruit, vegetables, nuts, less red meat, more unsaturated fats, and whole grain. That's it. But we have to be much better at getting that diet out as a positive story. And I think we can do that in a much, much better way. But I think it has to be combined also with some hard policies that starts really putting a price on what damages both the planet and the human health. And we have quite a lot of evidence to support that today.
Okay, loud. Yes, hello, my name is Mika Järvinen and I'm professor from Aalto University, and this microphone is not really... Can?
Come closer.
Oh, okay, good. I would like to go back to the hope issue. There was earlier a question on that. As an example, what I use, so I teach student renewable energy and sustainability in Aalto University, and as a case example or exercise that we were successful already was the COVID lockdown. Think about in 1 or 2 weeks, the whole world was in lockdown, emissions dropped, and I think this is an evidence that if we are afraid that we're gonna die, help, we can do it. But with the climate change and loss of or exceeding these planetary boundaries, they are happening much slower. So how can we make people to understand that, okay, this is also a threat, even though it's happening slowly, but it's how bad the situation have to come that people start to really believe that we need to act and fast. Thank you.
Okay. So I think one of the problems that a lot of the decisions are made by people who are not the most affected, and we know that countries such as Madagascar, where droughts and climate change is a question of life and death, whereas if you cannot find your favorite food item in a supermarket, you get something else. So I think there is a huge imbalance in terms of injustice really about what those problems are coming from. It is concerning that we're seeing glaciers melting and we're seeing extreme weather events, but there's also that message of hope. And when it comes to, for instance, biodiversity and nature restoration, even here in the tropics, if you do ecological restoration successfully within 10 years, 15 years, you'll see a forest which is thriving. You'll see monkeys, you'll see parrots, you'll see nature coming back. And nature has this incredibly powerful ability to bounce back if you give it a chance. And I think there are some parameters which would not be reverted in the very long run, but we do need to infuse hope. And I think that by just experiencing will probably be the way to most engage, because we need to be touching minds and hearts. And I think that's what we're failing. And I think people need to experience rather than just be told about those problems.
Yeah, let me just kind of perhaps be a little bit of a contrarian, not vis-a-vis you here, but I mean the general view is that we get recommended to not communicate too frequently about unmanageable, potentially disastrous outcomes of climate change. I'm of the view that it's completely 180 degrees the reverse we need to do, that we need to communicate much more frequently. And that's one of the lessons of COVID. I mean, as a Swede, those of you who are Swedes, you remember, at 2:00 p.m. every day, there was a press conference by Folkhälsomyndigheten. You had often a minister in the room, and they had the same message every day, 2:00 for 2 years. You're in danger. This is life-threatening. Stay at home, put on your masks, and wash your hands. And it was a very boring message. Every day, the same message. The script was written on day one. But what happened was we collectively rose to the challenge. And I can assure you that if we every day at 2:00 informed about the risk of the AMOC collapse and what the implications are, and if it's done every day, you'll hear a lot of voices saying, oh my God, I don't want to hear about this anymore. It's just so boring. How many people do really like to read every day about the Ukraine war or every day about the disaster in Gaza? Of course, it's very challenging. But I think it sinks in that, okay, I'm hearing this every bloody day. It must be important. Someone considers this to be important. If I go out on the street in Belém and ask people 1.5 degrees Celsius, what's your take on that? I can assure you nobody knows what the hell you're talking about. Even if I do it in Stockholm, won't people know about it? It's terrible. It's the most important number in the world, and nobody knows about it. I think we need to punch out much more communication, just in a la COVID method. It's not everything, of course. We have to have the positive stories. We have to have the cure. But I think we're completely failing. Bill Gates puts out a memo where he still claims that 2.5 degrees Celsius is not a big problem. I mean, honestly. There's no scientific evidence that we can manage a 2.5 degrees Celsius world. So we need to start communicating the better precision in the uncertainty range in science and be much more savvy at explaining risk. And that we all are placing ourselves in a very dangerous trajectory if we continue as today. But so few people understand this. Not even the negotiators, I would argue, have a full updated understanding of this. So, I mean, I think, I know that that's a clunky academic view. Sorry for that. But I really think that this is something that we have to be much better at communicating also the risk, not only the hope stories. We need both. I'm not shutting the door to the hope, but I think we need the diagnostic first and foremost.
Thank you. And our time is up. And as a head of communications, I couldn't be more happy that it ends with this note, the discussion, fully, of course. And thank you for questions. In a half an hour, we are going to have a reception here. So if you are hanging around, so you're most welcome to join. And thank you, everyone.
Thank you.